When we talk about conquest, we usually picture banners on the wind and maps dyed a single color. Trumpets. Victories. Dates you had to memorize for a test. But the real story of an empire isn't written in bright ink on a battlefield. It's written in small, cold lines, on ledgers, on census slips, on decisions made far from the noise. It's the quiet system that keeps working after the last arrow is loosed. That's the story you're about to hear. Tonight, we're not chasing the gallop of cavalry, we're following the paper trail. We're going to look at how power can be organized, itemized, and carried like cargo, how a victory becomes permanent not only by taking cities, but by reshaping families, names, and the future itself. This isn't a spectacle. There are no graphic scenes here. What there is clarity, the mechanism behind the myth. Because somewhere beyond the campfires and the chroniclers, there were ordinary lives, mothers, daughters, sons, folded into a machine that prized efficiency over identity. And if that sounds abstract, it isn't. It's as concrete as a wrist marked with a number, as ordinary as a clerk noting a birth, as devastating as a child raised to speak a language his mother never knew. It's the battle after the battle, the one fought in homes and lullabies, and the space where memory either survives or is replaced. So let's set aside the romance of conquerors and look, instead, at the cost. Not to glorify, not to shock, but to understand how power can move from the edge of a sword into the fabric of a society. Because once you see that process, you can't unsee it, and you'll never read a map the same way again. When we think about conquest, the image that usually comes to mind is a clean, simple one: banners fluttering in the wind, a general standing high on the hill, soldiers cheering as the enemy retreats. It's the version we learned in classrooms, written in tidy paragraphs and memorized for tests. But history rarely stays clean once you step off the page. The real story of empire isn't just written in the smoke of battle or in the glow of victory fires. It's written afterward, in the silence that follows, in the lists, ledgers, and laws that decide who lives where, who belongs to whom, and what happens when swords are sheathed. That's the part most history books summarize in a single line: the empire expanded. But that one sentence hides a world of human cost. In the early 13th century, when the Mongol Empire began to rise across the vast spine of Asia, its expansion didn't stop when the fighting did. It simply changed form. Behind every charge of cavalry came another army, one without armor or swords, but with scrolls, seals, and scribes. Their job was to transform chaos into order, to turn captives into subjects, and subjects into citizens of something larger, something permanent. The Mongols were more than writers and archers. They were administrators, thinkers, and above all, pragmatists. They didn't just conquer land, they studied how to keep it. And to keep it, they needed to understand people, who could be trusted, who might rebel, and how the next generation could be raised not as enemies, but as loyal members of a new order. This is where our story begins, not with the sound of hooves, but with the scratching of a pen on parchment. Imagine a small encampment somewhere on the Central Asian steppe. The air is cold but clear. Dawn light leaks through the flap of a felt tent. Inside, a man sits at a low wooden desk. He's not a warrior, not a noble. He's a clerk, one of hundreds who follow the Mongol armies across their endless campaigns. Before him lie ink, paper, and a long list of names. Each name represents a life, a family, a tribe now absorbed into something much larger. Some will become soldiers, some servants, others part of a network of relocated craftsmen, traders, and administrators. The clerk doesn't question it. His job is to count, record, and classify. History remembers generals, bureaucracy remembers everyone else. This, too, is conquest. The genius of Genghis Khan wasn't only in his tactics on horseback. It was in how he organized people afterward, how he saw the battlefield not as an end, but as the first step in reshaping society. He understood something most conquerors never did, that swords can win land, but systems keep it. And systems need structure. They need record-keeping, discipline, and control. When Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, unified the warring tribes of the Mongol steppe, he created not just a military alliance, but a framework, a structure that could survive him. He imposed laws, appointed ministers, codified taxation, and introduced methods of communication that spanned thousands of miles. Even his wars had logistics and paperwork. For the people caught in the Mongol advance, the battle itself was only the beginning. When the fires burned out and the noise faded, something quieter began, the reordering of lives. Entire populations were moved like pieces on a board. Skilled artisans were transported to cities they'd never heard of. Families were divided and reassigned. Languages mixed, cultures collided, and a new form of power emerged, administrative domination, not through constant violence, but through control of identity and belonging. To the Mongols, this wasn't cruelty, it was efficiency. It was the creation of order out of chaos. And in a way, it worked. The empire expanded faster than any before it, stretching from Korea to the edges of Europe in less than a lifetime. But for those who lived beneath its banners, the question wasn't glory, it was survival. Many chronicles, especially Persian and Chinese sources, speak of detailed registries, names, trades, family sizes, compiled after conquests. To us, they read like cold data, to them, they were life itself. Every mark of ink could decide whether a person was relocated, conscripted, or simply erased. And while Genghis Khan's empire is often remembered for its brutal military efficiency, what made it endure was its bureaucracy, a machinery so effective that even his enemies, after being conquered, were often employed to keep it running. But where did such precision come from? From the same man who, as a child, learned that survival was never guaranteed. Temujin's early years were a storm of betrayal and hunger. His father's death, his family's exile, and his years scavenging on the frozen plains taught him that power comes not from mercy, but from structure. When his mother taught her children to hunt, to find food, to endure, she was teaching him the first rule of governance: never depend on luck. Every hardship he faced became a lesson in organization. Every betrayal taught him the importance of loyalty and how to enforce it. So when he finally began uniting tribes, he did it through discipline. He replaced kinship with merit, favoritism with function. Warriors were promoted by performance, not birth. Messengers carried orders across thousands of kilometers. The chaos of the steppe was tamed, systematized. That instinct for order extended far beyond war. Temujin's empire wasn't a rampage, it was an evolving organism, absorbing skills, knowledge, and even people into its bloodstream. Chinese engineers built siege machines for Mongol armies. Persian scholars designed tax systems. Muslim doctors advised Mongol courts. Conquest, for Genghis Khan, meant integration, not annihilation, but absorption. Yet this drive for permanence had a cost. When an empire starts managing life itself, deciding who belongs, who can move, who can marry, power crosses into something intimate. It becomes not just political, but personal. Every empire seeks eternity, but the Mongols aimed for something subtler: legacy through lineage. The idea that domination could be biological, cultural, even linguistic. That the children of those conquered would grow up speaking the conqueror's tongue, thinking in their logic, loyal to their empire. Modern historians still debate how deliberate this policy was. But its effects are measurable even centuries later, in surnames, in genes, in traditions that bear the fingerprints of the steppe. To tell this story is not to romanticize it. It's to look squarely at how systems, once created, can outlive their makers. The soldiers who rode for Genghis Khan are dust. But the frameworks they built, the structures of control and assimilation, continued to shape Asia and Europe long after the last arrow was fired. So we return to that scribe in the tent. The candle flickers. His quill scratches the parchment. He isn't thinking about morality or empire. He's thinking about finishing his list before the sun rises. Outside, a new day spreads over the plains, quiet, orderly, indifferent. The riders are gone, but the system remains. That's what this story is really about. Not bloodshed, but the quiet endurance of structure. The way power, once organized, keeps breathing even when its creators are gone. History tends to celebrate the thunder of conquest. But its true legacy lives in the silence that follows, in the way people's names change, and how maps are redrawn, and how memory bends to fit what's been written in ink. Because when you control the record, you control the story. And when you control the story, you control the future. The wind across the Mongolian steppe does not forgive weakness. It carves through the bones, strips away comfort, and leaves only what can survive. Long before Temujin became Genghis Khan, before the banners, before the empire, there was only a hungry child standing in a frozen landscape, trying to understand why the world had turned its back on him. His father was dead. His clan had abandoned his family to die. His mother, Holon, gathered her children and told them the truth: no one was coming to save them. From that moment, Temujin learned the first law of his world: if you cannot take, you will be taken from. He was 9 years old when his father, Yasujii, was poisoned at a feast. The man who had led warriors now lay dead among those who once toasted him. The family's status evaporated overnight. On the steppe, leadership was not inherited, it was earned every day through strength. Without Yasujii, the family had nothing. The tribe cast them out, taking their herds and shelter, leaving Holon and her children to fend for themselves in a wilderness that respected no one. That exile became the forge that shaped the boy who would one day rule the known world. The winters were brutal. The family survived on roots, rodents, and fish caught in frozen streams. There were nights when hunger made them see shapes in the dark, when the sound of the wind became voices whispering that death was easier. Temujin's mother taught them to keep moving, to hide from raiders, to learn which plants would not poison them. Every day was a lesson in endurance. Every morning was proof that they had not yet been erased. Out there, morality was a luxury. Temujin learned to fight over scraps of food, to read the smallest signs in the landscape. He watched wolves hunt and understood that survival required not pity, but precision. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about never hesitating when everything depended on speed and decision. There's one story from this time that marks the beginning of the man history would come to fear. Temujin and his half-brother Bektir argued over a fish, one fish that could mean the difference between hunger and a meal. Bektir was older and stronger. He took it by force. Temujin and his younger brother Kasar tracked him down later that day. Bektir saw them coming. He didn't run. He only asked one thing: don't do it in front of mother. Temujin shot him anyway. It wasn't about the fish anymore. It was about proving that no one could take from him without consequence. When Holon discovered what he had done, she beat him until her hands bled. She screamed that he was a mad dog, that he destroyed his own family from within. But something in Temujin's eyes didn't change. He had learned another law: the world doesn't forgive weakness, and mercy is often just another word for defeat. That lesson would follow him into every decision he ever made. Years later, when Temujin was captured by a rival tribe, he was chained with a wooden yoke around his neck, treated like an animal. He waited, silent, biding his time, until one night he used the very tool meant to humiliate him as a weapon. He killed his guard and escaped into the night. From that moment, he understood that control wasn't about brute strength, it was about patience, about knowing when to wait and when to strike. By his teenage years, Temujin had already learned the 3 essentials of empire: discipline, fear, and loyalty. He knew that people followed not out of affection, but because you made them believe you could protect them or destroy them. When he became engaged to Borte, a young woman from a nearby clan, it was more than love, it was alliance. Her father saw something in Temujin, a spark of unbreakable will. That union was his first step back toward power, but it also led to the event that would change him forever. Not long after their marriage, raiders from the Merkit tribe attacked their camp. Borte was taken. For months, Temujin searched for her, gathering allies and calling in old debts. When he finally rescued her, she was alive, but changed. She was pregnant, and the child she carried might not have been his. The boy, Joki, would grow up under the shadow of that uncertainty, and that shadow haunted Temujin's mind for the rest of his life. Historians can only guess what went through him then. Some say guilt. Some say rage. But the truth might have been something colder, an understanding that the power to take and the inability to protect are 2 sides of the same failure. Borte's abduction showed him that military victory alone wasn't enough. True power meant controlling not just enemies, but generations. From that moment, his vision changed. The steppe was no longer a battlefield, it was a laboratory of survival. Temujin rebuilt his camp and his alliances. He studied the clans around him, not just their weapons, but their social structures, their loyalties, their weaknesses. He saw that chaos was constant because no one trusted anyone. So he made trust a weapon. He enforced loyalty with rewards and betrayal with extinction. He reorganized tribes into units that cut across bloodlines, binding warriors to him, not to their kin. He promoted men for their skill, not their birth, and punished even old friends when they broke his rules. To the steppe, this was shocking. To Temujin, it was natural. As his influence grew, so did the myth around him. Some saw him as a savior who could end the endless feuds of the steppe, others saw him as a storm gathering on the horizon. He learned to use that fear, to let rumor travel faster than his horses. His army was more than soldiers, it was an idea, and ideas, once they move, are harder to stop than arrows. By the time the tribes united under his banner, Temujin was no longer just a man. He was a symbol of inevitability. The people who had once cast his family into the cold now swore allegiance to him, calling him Khan of all Mongols. But beneath the titles and the ceremonies, the same boy from the wilderness still existed, the child who had once stood over his dying brother and decided that strength was the only justice. That memory, buried deep, became the seed of his empire. He had learned that mercy could be fatal, that power unrecorded was power wasted, and that to rule meant to understand every layer of life, from birth to death, from family to nation. His empire would reflect those beliefs. Every soldier, every scribe, every subject would exist within a system that rewarded obedience and erased hesitation. Temujin had transformed survival into governance, and governance into empire. But the same hunger that once drove him through snow and hunger would soon drive him toward something darker, a dream not of conquest, but of permanence. He wanted not just to win, but to shape the world itself, to make sure that no one could ever cast his name into the cold again. And to achieve that, he would build a machine that could outlast him, a system that didn't rely on loyalty alone, but on control, calculation, and fear. The boy who once starved in the wilderness had learned his lesson well. The world had no mercy for the weak, and so he would create a world where weakness itself could not exist. That was the birth of the empire, and the death of the man. When the tribes of the Mongolian steppe finally bent the knee, Temujin stood at the center of a land that had never known peace. What he inherited was not an empire, it was chaos stitched together by fear, loyalty, and exhaustion. The year was 1206. The boy who once scavenged for roots now stood before thousands of warriors who raised their banners and called him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. But in that moment of triumph, he understood something few conquerors ever do: the battle to win a world is brief, but the battle to keep it never ends. He had seen empires rise and crumble before they even dried the blood from their swords. Victory without order was dust in the wind. So while others celebrated conquest, Genghis Khan began building something different. He wanted a system, a structure that would last beyond him, something that no tribe or generation could undo. The first step was rewriting the rules of power. On the steppe, leadership had always been tied to family and tribe. Genghis destroyed that idea. He replaced blood with merit, loyalty, and usefulness. Every soldier, no matter his birth, could rise through ranks if he proved his worth. He dismantled old hierarchies and built a new one based on efficiency. The message was simple: your name does not matter, your obedience does. He divided his empire into units called Arban, 10 men, Zun, 100, Mingan, 1,000, and Tuman, 10,000. Each unit was led by a commander chosen not for noble blood, but for discipline and results. In a single stroke, he erased centuries of tribal politics. Soldiers from rival clans were forced to fight side by side, to eat together, to die together. Bonds of family were replaced by bonds of command. In doing so, Genghis Khan transformed warriors into machinery, flexible, loyal, and unstoppable. But he knew that control built only on fear could collapse as quickly as it rose. He needed law, a code that could hold people together when he was no longer there to enforce it. Thus came the Yasa, a vast legal framework that governed everything from military conduct to marriage, from theft to diplomacy. It punished betrayal, rewarded bravery, and outlawed the kind of internal strife that had once nearly destroyed his family. For the first time in steppe history, there was one law above all tribes, one authority greater than blood. Still, Genghis Khan's vision went beyond the battlefield. He was not content to rule a land of tents and grass. He wanted to connect worlds. His messengers rode from China to Persia faster than any courier system on Earth. Relay stations, small wooden huts stocked with food, horses, and maps, were built every few miles, allowing information to move across the continent like lightning. It was an empire of motion, where orders written in ink could travel faster than entire armies. And yet, behind the discipline and precision, there was something darker forming, a mindset that saw humanity itself as a resource to be cataloged, relocated, and optimized. Genghis Khan had learned from a lifetime of scarcity that people could be used the same way one might use horses or land. Conquered populations were sorted by skill, blacksmiths, scribes, builders, and healers were moved to where they were needed most. Others were sent to fight or labor. Every community was evaluated not by its identity, but by its function. To his admirers, this was genius, an empire run like a living organism. To his victims, it was a machine that erased individuality. And that was the secret to his permanence. He was not building a nation, he was building a system. Under this system, he did something few rulers dared. He opened the empire's borders to knowledge. Genghis Khan valued skill wherever he found it. He recruited Chinese engineers, Persian scholars, Arab doctors, and Uyghur scribes. He allowed religious freedom, understanding that faith was easier to control through tolerance than suppression. He encouraged trade along the Silk Road, creating safe passage for merchants from the Black Sea to the Pacific. Gold, silk, spices, and ideas flowed across his lands like rivers. But every system that promises order demands a price. The more the empire grew, the more it needed control, records, taxation, surveillance. Each conquered people had to be counted, each resource registered. The empire became a vast network of information, where the power of the pen grew equal to the sword. Behind every campaign rode not just generals, but record keepers, linguists, translators, and administrators. The ledger was the empire's second army. And yet, beneath the surface, Genghis never forgot the lessons of his youth. He trusted no one completely. He built overlapping chains of command so that no man could rise without being watched by another. Every governor, every military leader, every advisor knew they were replaceable. Loyalty was rewarded, but only as long as it was absolute. Those who betrayed him were not punished swiftly, they were erased, names removed from records, bloodlines dissolved, memory deleted. He called it justice. Others called it terror. Still, there was a kind of logic to his cruelty. Genghis Khan saw fear not as chaos, but as currency. Fear kept men obedient, kept order intact, kept the machine moving. And so, the empire that began with survival evolved into something that could not stop itself, a civilization running on control. When the Mongols entered new lands, they brought not just soldiers, but surveyors. Every city, every village, every farm was mapped and measured. Taxation followed the same patterns of precision as military conquest. The result was stability, a brutal, undeniable stability. Roads were safe, merchants thrived, even the poorest farmer could trade without being robbed. The empire, in its way, worked. And yet, as it spread, something else grew: silence. Cultures absorbed into the Mongol system lost their languages, their rituals, their songs. Children born in conquered lands were raised speaking Mongolian, taught Mongol customs, praying to Mongol spirits. Within a generation, entire peoples forgot what it had meant to be anything else. Genghis Khan saw this not as tragedy, but as success. For him, the empire was not about domination, it was about transformation. To rule forever, you had to make the conquered forget they were conquered. It was in this philosophy that his greatest innovation, and greatest horror, took root, the idea that order can justify anything. He believed that chaos was the true evil of the world, and that even cruelty was acceptable if it prevented disorder. To him, mercy was unpredictable, discipline was eternal. By the time he turned his gaze toward the Jin dynasty in northern China, his empire had already become a self-sustaining organism. Armies could march for months without losing supply, cities could be built and governed within weeks, and local leaders could be replaced in days. It was perfection, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface was a man who had long ago stopped seeing individuals. He saw only roles: soldier, subject, builder, breeder, resource. The wilderness had taught him to survive. Power had taught him to control. But control without compassion becomes machinery, and machinery does not stop. It keeps moving until it runs out of fuel, or until it consumes everything in its path. In his final years, as he looked out over the endless plains, Genghis Khan had achieved what no one else had: an empire that functioned like a living mind, vast, efficient, and relentless. Yet in that silence, somewhere between pride and emptiness, lingered the boy he once was, the child who had learned that the world shows no mercy, and who built an empire to make sure he would never need any again. By the time the Mongol banners rose above the walls of Zhongdu, Bokhara, and Samarkand, the empire was no longer just a military conquest, it was a system of control unlike anything the world had ever seen. What Genghis Khan built was not simply an army that could destroy cities, but an administrative machine that could rebuild them in his own image. Every raid, every campaign, every surrender fed into one goal: permanence. From the outside, the Mongol Empire looked unstoppable. Caravans moved safely across the Silk Road, connecting lands that had once been strangers. Markets thrived under Mongol protection. Merchants praised the Pax Mongolica, the peace of the steppes. But beneath that peace lay something deeper and more unsettling: an empire that had learned to control people not through constant war, but through organization, memory, and fear. Every conquest began with information. Mongol scouts didn't just map cities, they mapped lives. They learned how people worshipped, traded, married, and raised their children. They identified who led, who resisted, and who might betray. Knowledge became a weapon sharper than any blade. When a city fell, soldiers came second. Scribes came first. They recorded names, ages, professions, families, even physical descriptions. To rule a people, you first had to define them. The bureaucracy of empire grew like veins through the body of conquest. Clerks and translators worked alongside soldiers, ensuring every decision could be recorded, every human life translated into data. A potter was not simply a person, he was an entry in a ledger. A teacher became a category. A child was a potential subject. To Genghis Khan, numbers were order, and order was survival. At first, many conquered cities welcomed it. The Mongols rebuilt irrigation systems, reopened trade routes, and standardized taxes. Justice under the Yasa seemed fairer than the chaos of corrupt local rulers. You could appeal to a Mongol court and sometimes even win. Banditry nearly disappeared, and for the first time in memory, a merchant could ride from the Pacific to the Mediterranean without fear. It looked like peace. It felt like civilization. But it came at the price of freedom. The system demanded loyalty above all else. Anyone who broke the law, no matter their rank, was punished swiftly and publicly. A thief lost his hands. A liar lost his tongue. A traitor lost his name. The punishment was not always physical, sometimes it was erasure. Records were rewritten, entire families vanished from documents as though they had never existed. It was a weapon that struck deeper than the sword, to be forgotten. This was how Genghis Khan ensured obedience without constant bloodshed. The fear of being erased was stronger than the fear of dying. When people's lives depended on their place in the record, they did anything to stay visible and silent. And so the empire grew quiet. Cities rebuilt under Mongol supervision took on the same patterns: rectangular grids, guarded gates, markets organized by trade, and administrative offices in the center, always near the barracks. Everything was measured, everything catalogued. From the steppes of Mongolia to the streets of Persia, life began to look the same. Even language began to shift. Mongolian became the language of power. Laws were translated into local dialects, but the spirit remained foreign, precise, cold, unyielding. Children born in conquered lands learned Mongol customs, Mongol songs, Mongol prayers. Some of them would one day fight for the same empire that had conquered their parents. That was Genghis Khan's true genius, not destroying civilizations, but rewriting them from within. There were whispers, of course. Poets lamented the silence that came after conquest, the loss of stories and songs that once defined entire cultures. In taverns and marketplaces, people still spoke of the days before, their heroes, their gods, their kings, but always in hushed tones. Even memories had become dangerous. The empire tolerated no nostalgia. The past belonged only to the conqueror. And yet, in this quiet world, the machine of empire worked flawlessly. Taxes arrived on time. Grain was stored and redistributed. Soldiers rotated between regions to prevent rebellion. Information flowed upward, orders downward. It was efficient. It was terrifying. Historians would later call it the illusion of peace. To outsiders, the Mongols had brought stability. To those who lived beneath them, it was like living inside a cage so vast you could forget the bars existed. People learned to move within their boundaries, to think within their limits. And as long as they stayed useful, the system rewarded them. In his later years, Genghis Khan often sat at night with his scribes, reviewing reports from across his empire. He read about births, harvests, taxes, trade volumes. He asked not about glory, but about numbers. How many people? How much grain? How many horses? To him, data was destiny. He no longer needed to lead battles himself. The empire ran on its own momentum, powered by discipline and fear. Yet beneath his calm, something restless remained. The wilderness that had shaped him never fully left his soul. Even surrounded by gold, silk, and loyal generals, he remained haunted by the memory of the frozen steppe and his starving family. He had built the world's greatest empire, but part of him still lived in the boy who believed mercy was weakness. And so, he kept pushing outward. When one frontier was secure, he opened another. When one kingdom fell silent, he looked for the next to conquer. The Mongol machine devoured not just land, but imagination. It replaced chaos with structure, freedom with stability, life with obedience. And yet, for all its brutality, it also connected the world in ways no one had imagined. A scholar in Persia could read a Chinese text translated through Mongolian scribes. A merchant in Kiev could use paper money invented in Asia. Cultures met, clashed, merged. Trade routes became arteries of a single, beating empire. This was Genghis Khan's paradox. He destroyed worlds, yet he made a world. His armies burned libraries, yet his laws preserved knowledge. He silenced nations, yet he gave them the tools to communicate. He saw humanity as material to be shaped, and somehow, in doing so, he united it. But peace built on control cannot last forever. The empire's silence began to echo. After Genghis Khan's death, his descendants continued the machine, expanding it, refining it, mechanizing it. The sons of the conqueror inherited his system but not his vision. Without the hunger that had once driven him, they mistook efficiency for immortality. The system that had once guaranteed survival began to suffocate creativity. The same order that had made the empire powerful began to make it brittle. And yet, even centuries later, his design lived on. Modern historians can still trace the roads, the laws, the administrative patterns that began under his rule. His shadow stretches through maps, languages, and even DNA. The silence he created still hums beneath history's noise. In the end, Genghis Khan didn't just conquer territory, he conquered the concept of control. His empire became a mirror for every great power that came after him. The lesson he left behind was as chilling as it was simple: fear can build peace, but it cannot build freedom. The quietest empires are often the most dangerous because they teach people to stop asking questions. And when people forget to ask, history begins again. In the final years of his life, Genghis Khan ruled an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, from the frozen steppes of Siberia to the deserts of Persia. It was the largest contiguous empire in human history, built not only on blood and fire, but on structure and law. Yet, Even at the height of his power, something restless stirred inside him, a feeling he could neither silence nor conquer. He had united the tribes, crushed kingdoms, and reshaped civilizations, but one enemy still remained: time. The old Khan had grown cautious and reflective. His body bore the scars of decades of war, arrows, blades, frost, and exhaustion. His mind was sharper than ever, but his hands trembled slightly when he signed decrees. He rode less often, spoke more slowly, and spent long nights staring into the fire, tracing the edges of maps he had already conquered. The empire was thriving, but the man at its center was haunted by the one truth no empire could escape: nothing lasts forever. His generals saw a leader preparing for eternity. He saw a man running out of it. The great campaigns of his later years, against the Tanguts in the west of China and the Khwarezmian remnants to the south, were driven less by ambition than by inevitability. He knew that empires without expansion begin to decay. Like the heart that stops when blood stops moving, his empire needed constant motion to survive. But each victory brought no joy. Cities fell, rulers bowed, and still he felt the cold hand of mortality tightening around his name. Every night, he summoned his scribes to record new orders, new laws, and new decrees. He revised the Yasa, expanded the communication network, standardized coinage, and refined his census system. The empire had become his monument, an organism so vast that it could live without him. That was his comfort and his curse. Those who saw him in his final campaign spoke of a strange calm that had settled over him. The man who once roared across the battlefield now ruled through silence. He no longer celebrated conquest, he inspected logistics. He no longer boasted of glory, he demanded reports. To his men, it seemed as though he had already crossed into legend, watching the world from a place beyond it. But in private, Genghis Khan began to confront the limits of his power. He could control armies, laws, and people, but not death. His close advisors recorded long pauses in conversation, moments when the Khan would stare at the horizon and whisper, "The wind never stops moving." Why should men? He began asking questions not about victory, but about legacy. Would his sons hold the empire together? Would his system outlast the chaos of human greed? Would the order he created become freedom or a cage? He ordered his chroniclers to keep writing, to record every detail of Mongol life, from the smallest peasant to the greatest general. He wanted history itself to remember, to ensure that what he built could not be undone by time or silence. Yet even as he preserved the empire's memory, his own began to fade. In 1227, during his campaign against the western Xia, Tangut, kingdom, Genghis Khan fell from his horse and was severely injured. The fall aggravated an old wound, and infection set in. He continued to lead his troops, refusing to show weakness, but his body betrayed him. Fever came and went. His voice weakened. He ordered that no one speak of his condition, fearing that the news of his decline would ignite rebellion. Even as his strength failed, he commanded one final assault on the Tangut capital. When the city finally surrendered, Genghis Khan lay in his tent, too weak to stand. The empire's banners waved above the conquered land, and his generals brought him the news of victory. He nodded once, without a word. For the first time, victory meant nothing. On the last night of his life, he called his sons to his side. Joki was already gone, dead under mysterious circumstances. Chagatai, Ogidi, and Talyui knelt before him. The old Khan looked at them, not as heirs, but as men who would inherit his burden. "The world," he said quietly, "is too vast for one mind to hold. Share it, but do not divide it. Rule it, but do not own it." Those were among his final words. He died in silence. No music, no ritual, no fanfare. The exact cause remains unknown. Some say illness, others the infection from his injury, or even poisoning. His death, like much of his life, became legend. What followed was perhaps his greatest order of all: secrecy. His burial was to be kept hidden, his grave unknown. The soldiers who carried his body to its resting place were executed to protect the secret. Some accounts claim the funeral procession killed anyone who crossed their path, ensuring that no witness could reveal the location. The place where he was laid to rest remains a mystery to this day, a man who had conquered the earth, disappearing into it. But death did not end his reign. His empire, already an autonomous machine, kept moving. Orders continued to flow under his seal. New governors were appointed, new cities taxed. The illusion that Genghis Khan still lived persisted for months, maintained by his generals until succession was secure. When his death was finally announced, it came not as grief, but as inevitability. The system he built endured, expanded, even. His sons and grandsons carried the empire further west into Russia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. His grandson Kublai Khan would later rule China itself, founding the Yuan dynasty. The Mongol world became the first truly global civilization, connecting cultures that had never met, trading knowledge, religion, and ideas across continents. And yet, within that triumph lay the seed of decay. The same order that gave the empire strength also stripped it of adaptability. Without Genghis Khan's singular vision, the system became mechanical, efficient but hollow. Generals turned into governors, governors into kings. They inherited his laws but not his hunger. The silence that had once symbolized peace began to feel like stagnation. The people who had once feared the Mongols began to adapt, rebel, and reclaim their identities. The empire that had once seemed eternal began to fracture, piece by piece, under its own weight. But Genghis Khan's true legacy was never just territory, it was the idea of control, the belief that chaos could be defeated by order. That idea survived the fall of his empire. It echoes in every government that prizes efficiency over humanity, and every system that values obedience over freedom. His methods became the blueprint for every empire that came after, Roman, Ottoman, British, Soviet, all chasing the same illusion, that permanence can be engineered. 8 centuries later, his DNA still lives in millions, his laws still echo in modern administration, his memory still divides historians between admiration and horror. He became more than a man, he became a pattern, a reflection of civilization's greatest temptation, to trade freedom for order, passion for stability, life for control. Genghis Khan died believing he had conquered death through legacy. And in a way, he had. The empire is gone, the banners are dust, but the system remains, quiet and visible, still shaping the world in ways we barely recognize. In the end, perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all. The man who feared being forgotten ensured that the world would remember him forever, not as a hero, not as a monster, but as a mirror of what humanity becomes when it mistakes control for peace. Centuries have passed since the death of Genghis Khan, yet his presence lingers, silent, unseen, but undeniably alive in the blood and memory of humanity. History may bury kings and crumble empires, but genes, like whispers through time, endure. What the sword once carved into the earth, blood now carries through generations. And that is perhaps Genghis Khan's truest conquest, not in land, not in fear, but in the biology of millions who walk the earth today, unaware that they are living echoes of his empire. In the centuries following his death, the Mongol system he built did not simply vanish, it evolved. His descendants ruled vast territories, stretching from China to the Middle East, and even into parts of Eastern Europe. His grandson Kublai Khan founded the Yuan dynasty in China, blending Mongol power with Chinese bureaucracy. In Persia, another branch of the family established the Ilkhanate, merging steppe culture with Islamic traditions. Even in Russia, the Golden Horde reigned for centuries, its influence shaping Slavic identity, religion, and language. Everywhere the Mongols went, they left traces, names, laws, bloodlines, and ideas. But perhaps the most haunting trace of all is genetic. Modern geneticists studying Y chromosome markers discovered something astonishing. About 16 million men alive today, roughly 1 in every 200 men worldwide, are direct descendants of Genghis Khan. That number isn't a metaphor. It's biology's way of preserving empire. The same organizational systems that cataloged women and births during his reign ensured the continuation of a lineage unlike any in human history. The Mongol Empire may have fallen, but the genetic empire remained. From the plains of Kazakhstan to the valleys of Afghanistan, from northern China to the Caucasus Mountains, genetic patterns reveal a single unbroken thread, a signature of conquest encoded into humanity itself. It's a legacy that scientists can measure, but not one we can easily comprehend. What does it mean to have an empire that never really ended? For the Mongols, conquest was more than territory, it was transformation. Genghis Khan understood that control of the future required control of reproduction. He redefined conquest as inheritance. His empire was not simply geographic, it was genealogical. And even after the cities turned to dust and the banners fell silent, that invisible empire, the one built through blood, continued to spread, generation after generation. Yet his legacy is not just written in DNA. It lives in how the world thinks about power, structure, and expansion. Many of the administrative systems that defined modern empires trace their roots back to Mongol innovation. The idea of a centralized census, the use of postal routes and couriers, and the creation of standardized law codes all began under Genghis Khan's rule. The Mongol Empire was, in many ways, the first modern state, an organism of bureaucracy and movement, one that could adapt, replicate, and survive even after its founder was gone. But the legacy is double-edged. The same efficiency that built trade networks also organized atrocities. The same logistics that connected continents also perfected mass control. What the Mongols pioneered, others refined. The concept of empire as a system, a machine powered by human lives, would become the blueprint for centuries of imperial ambition. From the Roman bureaucrats to the British administrators, from the Ottomans to the Soviets, each inherited a version of Genghis Khan's dream, to make power permanent through systems, not just swords. And yet, beneath the structure, the human cost never disappeared. Archaeologists uncover the graves of women and children along the old caravan routes, their remains marked by violence and genetic mixing. Their stories, silent for centuries, emerge through science. DNA sequencing confirms what chronicles only hinted at: entire populations reshaped not by migration, but by forced assimilation. These findings raise uncomfortable truths about empire, identity, and how history records power. Because for all his brilliance, Genghis Khan's empire was built on a paradox. It sought order through destruction, peace through dominance, immortality through suffering. His genius lay not just in conquest, but in how he turned chaos into method. And yet that method had consequences that would echo across time. As centuries passed, the descendants of his bloodline scattered across continents. Some became kings and scholars. Others faded into anonymity. The genetic signature remained, but the memory of its origin began to blur. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan became a national hero, revered as a unifier, a lawgiver, a symbol of strength. In China, he became a figure of both admiration and caution, a reminder of the foreign dynasty that once ruled their land. In the West, he was long seen as the face of barbarism, a destroyer of civilizations. Only in recent decades has the world begun to see the full complexity of his legacy, both destroyer and creator, tyrant and innovator, a man who redefined what it meant to rule. The deeper one studies him, the harder it becomes to separate myth from memory. Did Genghis Khan truly intend to shape the world through bloodlines, or was that a consequence of a system that outgrew even its creator? Did he foresee a future where his name would live inside the DNA of millions, or did he simply seek survival in a world that demanded domination? What's clear is that his impact transcends morality. He stands as a mirror to human civilization itself, the drive to expand, to organize, to endure, no matter the cost. In his story, we see the birth of modern ambition, the belief that permanence can be engineered, that destiny can be written not in stone or scripture, but in the structure of generations. Today, scientists can trace his lineage with precision, but they cannot measure the psychological inheritance he left behind. His empire taught humanity how to build systems that survive individuals, how to institutionalize power so thoroughly that it becomes invisible. The Mongols conquered with bows and horses, but they ruled with information, census data, communication lines, bureaucratic control. And in many ways, the modern world still runs on those same principles. Even the idea of globalization, the movement of goods, people, and ideas across continents, has its roots in Mongol governance. The Silk Road, once a perilous network of deserts and mountains, became safe under Mongol protection. For the first time in history, a merchant could travel from Venice to Beijing under a single authority. Trade flourished, cultures blended, and knowledge spread. Paper, gunpowder, printing, and philosophy flowed across borders that had once been deadly barriers. Genghis Khan might never have imagined the internet, but the logic that built it, the unification of networks under a single system, was born in his empire. And yet, there's a haunting truth buried beneath all this progress. Every modern system of control, every surveillance state, every empire of data owes something, however distant, to his vision. The dream of perfect efficiency that began in the tents of the steppe now manifests in algorithms and databases. The tools have changed, but the goal is the same: control through knowledge, permanence through structure. That is the shadow of Genghis Khan's legacy, a reminder that progress and domination often share the same blueprint. 800 years later, his name still commands both awe and unease. In Mongolia, people still raise glasses of fermented milk and whisper prayers to the eternal blue sky, honoring the man who united their ancestors. In laboratories, scientists trace the patterns of his DNA, astonished at how far his legacy has spread. And in classrooms and films, his story is retold again and again, not just as history, but as prophecy. Because Genghis Khan's empire never truly ended. It lives in our systems, in our languages, in our laws, in our blood. His story is not just about the past, it is about what humanity becomes when it seeks immortality through control. He conquered everything except death. But in doing so, he conquered something greater: oblivion. Centuries later, the echo of Genghis Khan still drifts across the steppes like wind over tall grass, felt, but unseen. The world remembers him in fragments: the conqueror, the strategist, the empire builder. But what the world often forgets is the silence that followed, the silence of the conquered, the forgotten, the erased. Every empire leaves behind a myth. He's left behind a void that still hums beneath the surface of history. When people speak of Genghis Khan, they speak of scale. They mention the maps that turned red under his armies, the nations reshaped by his riders, the millions who perished in the shadow of his ambition. They recall the fear that swept through cities at the sound of hooves, the walls that trembled before the Mongol siege engines. But beyond the noise of war, there was another world, a quieter one, that never got to speak. It was the world of those who endured rather than fought, those whose stories never made it into chronicles written by victors or scholars. History, as it's taught, often glorifies survival through conquest. Yet true survival is quieter. It's found in the whispered prayers of mothers who refuse to forget their children's names, in the lullabies sung in secret after the soldiers passed, and the small rituals of remembrance carried through generations. The Mongol Empire, for all its power and vision, was built upon these silences, an ocean of untold stories beneath the surface of every victory. In the centuries that followed the empire's collapse, this silence deepened. The lands that once trembled before Mongol banners rebuilt themselves, but the scars never truly healed. China rose again, Persia redefined itself, the Rus forged kingdoms from ruin, and Europe wrote its chronicles of resistance and revenge. But in every place the Mongols touched, something fundamental shifted. Cultures blended, languages fused, borders blurred. The old world ended, and a new one, connected, interwoven, and complicated, took its place. Yet for the descendants of those who lived through it, the legacy was not unity, but confusion. Identities fractured. Entire peoples lost track of their roots. Villages forgot which ancestors were theirs and which came from conquerors. Bloodlines merged beyond memory, and the truth of who came from whom dissolved into legend. In that ambiguity, Genghis Khan's empire achieved something no other empire ever had. It became invisible, living not in monuments or ruins, but in memory and DNA. Modern historians and geneticists have tried to reconstruct that invisible empire. They trace markers, chart migrations, connect the invisible dots that stretch from Mongolia to the Balkans. But for all their science, they can't capture what those markers meant to the people who carried them. A strand of DNA can tell you who your ancestors were, but not how they lived or what they lost. It can't tell you the sound of a mother's cry in a burning city, or the silence of a steppe night after the soldiers had moved on. The truth is, history is not just a record of what happened, it's a record of what humanity chooses to remember. And for centuries, the world chose to remember Genghis Khan's victories while forgetting the suffering that sustained them. His face became a symbol of strength, his name an icon of ambition. Statues were raised, cities named, coins minted, all celebrating the man who once turned empires to dust. But the women, the children, the erased families who bore the true weight of that empire, they remained unnamed, their stories scattered like ashes in the wind. In recent years, as archaeology and historical research have advanced, fragments of those silenced lives have begun to re-emerge. Excavations across Central Asia have uncovered mass graves, sites of entire communities wiped out during Mongol invasions. The bones tell stories without words, crushed skulls, broken wrists, the hurried burials of those who never stood a chance. But among those graves, archaeologists have also found traces of resilience, objects hidden for remembrance, a carved pendant with a family mark, a child's bracelet, a piece of embroidered cloth folded carefully under stone. Small things that say, "We were here." The paradox of Genghis Khan's legacy is that he unified the world by destroying its borders, yet in doing so, he erased countless worlds that will never return. His empire made possible the exchange of goods and ideas on a scale unseen before: gunpowder, paper, medicine, philosophy. The Silk Road flourished under his protection, bridging continents and cultures. But this exchange came at a price, thousands of voices silenced to make room for one grand narrative of order. The empire's strength was also its tragedy. It turned the diversity of humanity into a single system of obedience. Even today, his image is both celebrated and feared. In Mongolia, his name, Genghis Khan, is sacred, evoking pride and identity. His portrait adorns currency, his name graces airports, streets, and even brands of vodka. To Mongolians, he is not a conqueror but a father figure, the unifier who gave them a nation. To others, he is a warning, proof of how ambition and structure can turn humanity into machinery. The duality of his legacy reflects our own nature, the capacity to create and destroy in the same breath. But beyond monuments and myths, there lies something deeper, a question of memory. How do we remember those whose names were never written? How do we honor the millions who became statistics in the ledgers of empire? The women taken, the children lost, the cultures that vanished? Their silence is the shadow side of every civilization's triumph. And to confront that silence is not to weaken history, but to humanize it. For centuries, humanity has told stories of heroes, men who conquered, ruled, and built. But perhaps the truer measure of civilization lies in remembering those who endured, not those who triumphed. The Mongol women who sang to their children in captivity, the traders who rebuilt after the armies left, the scholars who preserved knowledge under foreign rule, they too were architects of history, even if history refused to record their names. When we talk about the empire of Genghis Khan today, we talk about maps and bloodlines, but maybe we should talk about echoes. Every time a mother whispers a prayer of protection, every time a community rebuilds from ruin, every time humanity chooses life after devastation, that is where the true legacy lies. Not in the conqueror, but in those who survived him. Because in the end, the greatest empire is not one built on conquest or control, it's memory. Memory that refuses to die, even when silenced. Memory that carries pain and pride in equal measure. Memory that insists that history is not just the story of power, but the story of endurance. And perhaps that is the final truth of Genghis Khan's story, that the silence left behind by his empire speaks louder than his victories. It reminds us that every empire, no matter how vast, is temporary. But the human will to remember, to hold on, to rebuild, to forgive, lasts forever. History will always celebrate the ones who ruled the world. But humanity will always belong to those who kept it alive. Centuries later, the echo of Genghis Khan still drifts across the steppes like wind over tall grass, felt, but unseen. The world remembers him in fragments, the conqueror, the strategist, the empire builder. But what the world often forgets is the silence that followed, the silence of the conquered, the forgotten, the erased. Every empire leaves behind a myth. Has left behind a void that still hums beneath the surface of history. When people speak of Genghis Khan, they speak of scale. They mention the maps that turned red under his armies, the nations reshaped by his riders, the millions who perished in the shadow of his ambition. They recall the fear that swept through cities at the sound of hooves, the walls that trembled before the Mongol siege engines. But beyond the noise of war, there was another world, a quieter one, that never got to speak. It was the world of those who endured rather than fought, those whose stories never made it into chronicles written by victors or scholars. History, as it's taught, often glorifies survival through conquest. Yet true survival is quieter. It's found in the whispered prayers of mothers who refused to forget their children's names, and the lullabies sung in secret after the soldiers passed, and the small rituals of remembrance carried through generations. The Mongol Empire, for all its power and vision, was built upon these silences, an ocean of untold stories beneath the surface of every victory. In the centuries that followed the empire's collapse, this silence deepened. The lands that once trembled before Mongol banners rebuilt themselves, but the scars never truly healed. China rose again, Persia redefined itself, the Rus forged kingdoms from ruin, and Europe wrote its chronicles of resistance and revenge. But in every place the Mongols touched, something fundamental shifted. Cultures blended, languages fused, borders blurred. The old world ended, and a new one, connected, interwoven, and complicated, took its place. Yet for the descendants of those who lived through it, the legacy was not unity, but confusion. Identities fractured. Entire peoples lost track of their roots. Villages forgot which ancestors were theirs and which came from conquerors. Bloodlines merged beyond memory, and the truth of who came from whom dissolved into legend. In that ambiguity, Genghis Khan's empire achieved something no other empire ever had. It became invisible, living not in monuments or ruins, but in memory and DNA. Modern historians and geneticists have tried to reconstruct that invisible empire. They trace markers, chart migrations, connect the invisible dots that stretch from Mongolia to the Balkans. But for all their science, they can't capture what those markers meant to the people who carried them. A strand of DNA can tell you who your ancestors were, but not how they lived, or what they lost. It can't tell you the sound of a mother's cry in a burning city, or the silence of a steppe night after the soldiers had moved on. The truth is, history is not just a record of what happened, it's a record of what humanity chooses to remember. And for centuries, the world chose to remember Genghis Khan's victories while forgetting the suffering that sustained them. His face became a symbol of strength, his name an icon of ambition. Statues were raised, cities named, coins minted, all celebrating the man who once turned empires to dust. But the women, the children, the erased families who bore the true weight of that empire, they remained unnamed, their stories scattered like ashes in the wind. In recent years, as archaeology and historical research have advanced, fragments of those silenced lives have begun to re-emerge. Excavations across Central Asia have uncovered mass graves, sites of entire communities wiped out during Mongol invasions. The bones tell stories without words, crushed skulls, broken wrists, the hurried burials of those who never stood a chance. But among those graves, archaeologists have also found traces of resilience, objects hidden for remembrance, a carved pendant with a family mark, a child's bracelet, a piece of embroidered cloth folded carefully under stone. Small things that say, "We were here." The paradox of Genghis Khan's legacy is that he unified the world by destroying its borders, yet in doing so, he erased countless worlds that will never return. His empire made possible the exchange of goods and ideas on a scale unseen before: gunpowder, paper, medicine, philosophy. The Silk Road flourished under his protection, bridging continents and cultures. But this exchange came at a price, thousands of voices silenced to make room for one grand narrative of order. The empire's strength was also its tragedy. It turned the diversity of humanity into a single system of obedience. Even today, his image is both celebrated and feared. In Mongolia, his name, Genghis Khan, is sacred, evoking pride and identity. His portrait adorns currency, his name graces airports, streets, and even brands of vodka. To Mongolians, he is not a conqueror but a father figure, the unifier who gave them a nation. To others, he is a warning, proof of how ambition and structure can turn humanity into machinery. The duality of his legacy reflects our own nature, the capacity to create and destroy in the same breath. But beyond monuments and myths, there lies something deeper, a question of memory. How do we remember those whose names were never written? How do we honor the millions who became statistics in the ledgers of empire? The women taken, the children lost, the cultures that vanished? Their silence is the shadow side of every civilization's triumph. And to confront that silence is not to weaken history, but to humanize it. For centuries, humanity has told stories of heroes, men who conquered, ruled, and built. But perhaps the truer measure of civilization lies in remembering those who endured, not those who triumphed. The Mongol women who sang to their children in captivity, the traders who rebuilt after the armies left, the scholars who preserved knowledge under foreign rule, they too were architects of history, even if history refused to record their names. When we talk about the empire of Genghis Khan today, we talk about maps and bloodlines, but maybe we should talk about echoes. Every time a mother whispers a prayer of protection, every time a community rebuilds from ruin, every time humanity chooses life after devastation, that is where the true legacy lies. Not in the conqueror, but in those who survived him. Because in the end, the greatest empire is not one built on conquest or control, it's memory. Memory that refuses to die, even when silenced. Memory that carries pain and pride in equal measure. Memory that insists that history is not just the story of power, but the story of endurance. And perhaps that is the final truth of Genghis Khan's story, that the silence left behind by his empire speaks louder than his victories. It reminds us that every empire, no matter how vast, is temporary. But the human will to remember, to hold on, to rebuild, to forgive, lasts forever. History will always celebrate the ones who ruled the world. But humanity will always belong to those who kept it alive. In the end, history remembers Genghis Khan as both a creator and a destroyer, a man who reshaped the world, not merely through conquest, but through the relentless pursuit of permanence. His empire is gone, his cities are dust, yet his legacy remains woven into the fabric of humanity itself. And that, perhaps, is his most haunting triumph, that he succeeded where every conqueror before him failed. He made himself eternal. But eternity, as history has shown, always comes with a cost. The Mongol Empire did not simply vanish, it fragmented, adapted, and dissolved into the civilizations it once conquered. Each fragment carried a piece of his design. China inherited his bureaucracy and infrastructure. The Middle East absorbed his trade routes and administrative models. Eastern Europe adopted his military strategies, shaping warfare for centuries to come. The systems he built became templates for empires long after his name had faded from their banners. Yet the deeper truth, the one rarely spoken, is that his greatest creation was not the empire itself, but the idea of empire as a system that could outlive its maker. That idea became humanity's obsession. From the Ottoman sultans to Napoleon, from colonial monarchies to modern superpowers, every empire since has chased the same illusion, that control can be perfected, that permanence can be engineered. The blueprint of Genghis Khan's world, efficient, ordered, ruthless, continues to echo through our institutions, governments, and technologies. We build systems to manage chaos, to preserve order, to make the world predictable. And yet, in doing so, we repeat his paradox: the pursuit of immortality through control always leads to decay. Because what Genghis Khan understood, perhaps better than anyone, is that power is never satisfied with mere dominance. It always seeks to shape the future, to bend time itself. He believed that through structure, law, and bloodline, he could conquer not only people, but history. His administrators counted lives the way accountants count coins. His generals mapped human geography the way shepherds map herds. His scribes turned the chaos of the world into ledgers and laws, convinced that documentation could defeat oblivion. It was an act of genius, and an act of profound arrogance. In the centuries since, humanity has refined that same instinct. We've replaced parchment with data, scribes with algorithms, maps with satellites. We tell ourselves that information equals control, that knowledge guarantees safety. Yet the underlying pattern is unchanged. We are still building empires, not with swords, but with servers, not through blood, but through code. The same dream that drove Genghis Khan's conquests drives our digital world today, the desire to make chaos obey. But like his empire, ours is built on contradictions. The more connected the world becomes, the more fragile it grows. The more we seek to preserve memory, the faster we lose meaning. The more we quantify life, the more we forget to live it. The legacy of Genghis Khan is not only written in the history of power, it's written in the psychology of civilization. His empire teaches us that control and immortality are illusions that demand endless sacrifice. And those who chase them often destroy the very humanity they wish to preserve. Even in his time, the old Khan began to see the shadow of his own creation. Toward the end of his life, as his armies pushed farther west and his empire stretched beyond sight, he grew obsessed not with victory, but with continuity. He saw how easily human ambition could outgrow compassion, how systems designed to protect could become instruments of cruelty. In his final years, he ordered new laws to protect merchants and commoners, to establish peace across conquered lands. It was as if he wanted to tame the monster he had unleashed, the machinery of empire itself. But it was too late. The system no longer belonged to him. It belonged to history. That is the curse of builders. The moment their creation becomes greater than themselves, it ceases to serve its maker. Genghis Khan's empire, like every empire since, became a mirror of human nature, brilliant, disciplined, and mercilessly self-destructive. And in that reflection lies the lesson we still struggle to learn. Power endures only by changing shape. When its physical form collapses, its spirit seeps into new structures: religion, government, ideology, technology. That is how Genghis Khan survives. Not as a ruler of land, but as a principle, the belief that the world can be unified through order. That belief continues to guide everything from geopolitics to global markets, from the algorithms that predict our desires to the nations that claim to protect us. But beneath that order lies silence, the same silence that followed his conquests. The silence of those erased, those unnamed, those absorbed by history's machinery. The empire's brilliance was inseparable from its cruelty. The peace it brought came at the cost of voices that would never be heard. And if we listen closely, that silence still hums beneath our modern world. Every time a system values efficiency over empathy, every time progress demands obedience, every time individuality is sacrificed for unity, the echo returns. The empire breathes again. Yet the story of Genghis Khan is not one of condemnation. It is one of understanding, of seeing what humanity becomes when it pushes the boundaries of power, and what it loses in return. His life was a study in extremes: ruthless pragmatism and visionary genius, destruction and creation intertwined. He revealed both the potential and peril of human ambition. He proved that will alone can reshape the world, but also that reshaping the world often means breaking it first. 8 centuries later, we stand in the shadow of his legacy, still balancing between chaos and control. His empire may have ended, but his question remains: can order exist without domination? Can peace exist without submission? Can humanity build something eternal without destroying itself in the process? No empire has yet answered those questions. The bones of his soldiers lie buried under layers of time, their banners turned to dust. But the systems they built, the trade routes, the networks, the logic of empire, still define how we live, travel, and think. Even his genetic legacy endures, carried silently in millions of bodies across continents. The empire has become invisible, no longer a map of land, but a pattern within us. And maybe that was always the point. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer the world, he rewired it. He turned history into a reflection of his will, ensuring that long after his name faded, his structure would remain. We live inside that structure still, in our cities, our governments, our data grids, our sense of progress. His story didn't end with his death, it became our own. But perhaps the final lesson he leaves us with is this: immortality is not measured by how long your name is remembered, but by how deeply your actions shape the world that follows. Genghis Khan achieved eternity not through worship, but through consequence. His empire, for all its brutality, forced humanity to confront what it means to be united, and what it costs to achieve that unity. The winds of the Mongolian steppe still whisper his name. Not in reverence, not in fear, but as a reminder. That power, no matter how great, always carries a shadow. That control, no matter how complete, can never silence the human spirit. And that history, no matter how carefully written, will always belong to those brave enough to remember what it tried to forget. Because in the end, Genghis Khan did not conquer the world. He revealed it. The wind that moves across the Mongolian steppe today is the same wind that carried the dust of Genghis Khan's armies 8 centuries ago. It whispers through the grasslands, through the ruins of forgotten cities, through the bones of both conquerors and conquered alike. Empires die, names fade, monuments crumble, but the wind remains. It carries memory, unseen but eternal. And in that wind lives the last truth of Genghis Khan's story, that nothing built by force can escape the silence that follows it, yet nothing truly ends as long as it is remembered. Centuries have passed since his riders thundered across Asia. The world he once ruled is now divided into nations and borders that would have meant nothing to him. The empires that followed have risen and fallen like waves, each convinced it would last forever, each eventually erased by time. But the essence of what he built, the vision of unity through structure and order, remains alive in how the modern world still functions. Every network, every global system, every empire of data and economy traces its roots back to his idea that control could outlive mortality. And yet, as history turns its pages, humanity begins to ask a quieter question: what was the cost of that vision? For every empire that sought to conquer, there were millions who paid the price in silence, the nameless, the forgotten, the erased. Genghis Khan's genius created a new kind of civilization, but it also revealed something far older and darker in the human condition: our endless hunger to shape the world, even when it means consuming it. Modern Mongolia remembers him not as a destroyer, but as a father, the man who gave their people identity, unity, and pride. His statues rise tall and gleaming under the eternal blue sky, their steel reflections catching the sunlight like fire. Tourists come from across the world to see the monument of the great Khan on horseback, frozen in eternal motion, gazing across the steppe. To his descendants, he is not the butcher the chronicles describe, but a symbol of resilience, proof that even from the harshest wilderness, greatness can rise. But beyond those borders, his name still carries dual meanings. To some, he is the visionary who connected civilizations, enabling the exchange of science, trade, and art across continents. To others, he remains a shadow, a name spoken in the same breath as devastation and fear. Both versions are true. His empire was not a myth of good or evil, but a mirror, reflecting the extremes of human potential. And that is what makes his story timeless. Every generation finds its own Genghis Khan. Some see him in the innovators who reshaped the world, others in the tyrants who try to control it. His ghost lingers wherever ambition outpaces compassion, wherever order becomes obsession, wherever progress demands submission. The spirit that once rode with his armies now rides through boardrooms, algorithms, and governments. It whispers to those who believe that the future can be engineered, that chaos can be conquered forever. But history has never obeyed. Even the greatest systems eventually falter. The Romans believed their empire was eternal. The Ottomans, the British, the Soviets, all claimed permanence. All learned the same lesson. Every structure humanity builds eventually turns into its opposite. Power becomes fragility, control breeds rebellion, unity dissolves into fragmentation. The Mongol Empire was no exception. It stretched farther than any before it, but it too fractured into silence. And yet, in that silence, something beautiful survived. The people. The stories. The songs whispered in forgotten dialects. The DNA that carried on through centuries of change. The caravan routes that became trade highways. The cultural bridges that turned into modern nations. The empire may have died, but its resonance endured, not as domination, but as connection. That is the paradox of Genghis Khan's legacy. He destroyed in order to unite, and what he united could only survive once his destruction ended. His empire was an act of creation through chaos, a storm that left behind fertile ground. Even today, echoes of his world remain visible in the smallest details of modern life. The concept of passports traces its roots to the Pesa tablets issued by his officials, safe-conduct tokens that guaranteed the bearer protection and passage anywhere in the empire. International trade owes much to the Mongol routes that linked east and west. The foundations of modern postal systems and intelligence networks began with his couriers racing across vast distances, connecting cities faster than any civilization before them. In his quest to control the world, he accidentally connected it. And in doing so, he shaped the modern age more profoundly than any single ruler before or after him. But power, once born, never disappears. It changes form. What began with horsemen and parchment now lives in the invisible empires of data and technology. The logic of Genghis Khan's world, that knowledge is power, that systems can rule men more efficiently than men can rule systems, has become the core of our digital civilization. The empire of land has become the empire of information. And once again, humanity finds itself at the same crossroads he faced. Do we rule the system, or does the system rule us? Perhaps that is his final lesson. Genghis Khan's empire was built on control, but its survival depended on adaptability. He succeeded not because he crushed resistance, but because he absorbed it. He turned enemies into allies, cultures into networks. That flexibility allowed his empire to thrive longer than those built purely on fear. If the modern world has inherited his systems, then perhaps it must also inherit his pragmatism, the ability to change before collapse, to evolve before destruction. Because every empire, no matter how vast, eventually faces its own reckoning. The same winds that carried his banners now carry satellites. The same steps that once echoed with hooves now hold fiber optic cables beneath their soil. The tools have changed, the challenge has not. Humanity is still trying to master chaos without becoming part of it. And maybe that's what the wind remembers, not just the cruelty or the conquest, but the persistence. The refusal to disappear. The endless cycle of creation and destruction that defines every age. In the fading light of the steppe, it's easy to imagine him still there, not as a warrior or a tyrant, but as a presence. The wind rises and bends the grass. The horizon glows gold and violet. The world turns, and for a moment, it feels like time itself is breathing. The empire is gone. The conqueror is dust. But the idea that humanity can build something greater than itself still rides the wind. And that is the truest form of immortality. Because as long as we remember, as long as we question, as long as we build, destroy, and rebuild again, Genghis Khan's story is not over. It lives within us, within every system we create, every dream we pursue, every empire we attempt to outlast time itself with. History may try to close its pages, but the wind will always whisper his name. Not as a warning, not as worship, but as memory.